quiet out here. There's seagulls. The sun is warm, but it's not too humid. It's actually kind of a great day for fishing. That's why it stinks.
Yeah, what does it smell like?
It smells like dead fish. It smells like the water.
What is going through your head right now?
I don't know. Thinking about what they went through. I don't know. I just wonder a lot what it was like. They say our people were born on the water. When it occurred, no one can say for certain. Perhaps it was in the second week or the third, but surely by the fourth, when they had not seen their land or any land for so many days that they lost count. It was after the fear had turned to despair, and the despair to resignation, and the resignation gave way, finally, to resolve. They knew then that they would not hug their grandmothers again, or share a laugh with a cousin during his nuptials, or sing their babies softly to sleep with the same lullabies that their mothers had once sung to them. The teal eternity of the Atlantic Ocean had severed them so completely that it was as if nothing had ever existed before, that everything they ever knew had simply vanished from the earth. Some could not bear the realization. They heaved themselves over the walls of wooden ships to swim one last time with the ancestors. Others refused to eat, mouths clamped shut until their hearts gave out. But in the suffocating hull of a ship called the White Lion, bound for where they did not know, those who refused to die understood that the men and women chained next to them in the dark were no longer strangers. They had been forged in trauma. They had been made black by those who believed themselves to be white. And where they were headed, black equals slave. So these were their people now.
What happened here?
What do you mean?
On August 20th, 1619.
So, from the New York Times Magazine, I'm Nikole Hannah-Jones. This is 1619.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We want to thank you and for coming out to Shape Our House for Amistad's Fall Conversation in Color series. This evening we're going to be fortunate to have Ms. Nikole Hannah-Jones and Dr. Terrefe from Tulane University. We want to thank you all for not only on a 10-day off, so we want to thank our sponsors, the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the Links Crescent City Chapter, Coterie Association Pleasant Club, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Terrefe and Ms. Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Can everybody hear me? No? Okay. How about now? Yes. All right. Well, it's my honor to be in conversation with Nikole today. This is better? Okay. Well, it's my honor today to be in conversation with our guests, and I'm just going to dive into my questions. From reading your introduction and listening to your podcast of it, what we all heard just now, it's clear this project arose from questions and matters of meaning that were deeply personal to you as a member of a community embedded in the trauma of what has been silenced, if not evacuated from historical narratives. A silencing and evacuation that carries socio-political consequences that your project lays bare. And therein lies more than a question. For me, because it's about how meaning is made, as well as the violence of erasure. The accomplishment of this project's affective and ethical meaningfulness is bound to broader political questions about how and whose modes of meaning become part of a society's broader cultural and historical archive. So what steps did you take to ensure that African Americans could reclaim perhaps this desire, or dare I say right, to make meaning, and what political roadblocks did you anticipate or face in the process?
Okay. Oh, we're not supposed to use these? Okay. Hello? Y'all can hear me?
Yes.
First, let me just say, hey, New Orleans. Really excited to be here because, as I'm sure you all know, New Orleans played such a pivotal role in the institution of slavery, the expansion of slavery, the breaking apart of black families. I think, the largest slave market in the nation was here, and people were bought and sold in some 50 plus sites across the city, and more than 100,000 black families were broken apart right here in New Orleans as part of the slave trade. But also it's a city that, of course, you can look around and the impact and contributions of those people who were brought here to be enslaved are just absolutely indelible. It's the only reason people come to New Orleans is because of the contributions of those who were enslaved. So it's both a testimony to the atrocities, but also a testimony to the resilience and the resistance of those people who I say were born on the water. So now I'll answer your question. So there were a couple of things that were really important about this project to me. I've been thinking about 1619 since I was a high school student a few years ago. And that's when I first came across the date 1619. My high school offered a one-semester Black Studies course, and in that one semester we were going to learn about all of ancient Africa and all of Black America up until the Civil Rights Movement in about 3.5 months. But even in that clearly surveyed class, I learned more about Black people than I had learned in my entire 10 to 11 years of public education prior to that. And I just developed this insatiable appetite because for the first time in my life, my world started to make sense to me, and the role of Black people started to make sense to me, and the conditions of Black people started to make sense to me when I studied this history. So I would just keep asking my teacher, who was the only Black male teacher I ever had, to give, I'll get to your answer. I'm building up to it. I kept asking him, as soon as I finished a book, give me another book. I just wanted to keep reading. And that's when eventually he gave me this book called Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. And it was about page 28 or 29 that I came across the year 1619. And it was really like a lightning bolt to me because every American child knew the Mayflower. We knew that ship. We were taught that that ship was important to the story of America. Yet here was this other ship called the White Lion that arrived a year before and certainly was carrying more momentous cargo than the Mayflower, but we'd never been taught that ship's name or that year. And I just understood, even as a 10th grader, that that was intentional. There was a reason we knew about one and not the other. And I was determined to find out what else don't we know? What other stories are they not telling us and why? So I went on, that was the same year I also joined my high school newspaper. And it was that same Black Studies teacher who told me when I complained I was part of a group of Black kids who were bused into white schools as part of a desegregation plan. And I told him that our high school paper never wrote about kids like me. And he said, if you don't like it, shut up, stop complaining about it, go join the paper, or don't come in here and say anything else. And I'm an Aries, so you challenge me, I will always, always take you up on the challenge. So I joined my high school paper. So it was that year in school that kind of the two moments that came together that would eventually produce the 1619 Project sparked, because I started to think about journalism as a profession. I became aware that history was so much a part of understanding where things were today. And I've been thinking pretty obsessively about that year for the 5 years since I graduated high school. So fast forward to probably about November of last year, and I'm thinking about this anniversary, and that it's 400 years, and when do you get an opportunity to commemorate and think about 400 years of anything, but really 400 years of what's one of the most central things in the American story, but also one of the most marginalized things. And I knew most Americans had never heard of 1619. They were not going to acknowledge this in any way. And I'm at the New York Times, one of the most important journalism platforms in the country, and I have a position to do something about that. So that's what made me pitch the project. But what was important, and I think this is where I'm finally going to answer your question, what was important about the project was, one, that it was not going to be a history, that it was actually going to seek to answer that question that every Black person always gets, which is, slavery was a long time ago, why don't you get over it? I was going to show that we can't get over it because we are still living daily with the legacy, and that legacy is across almost every aspect of American life that you can look at. If you study it, if you trace the history back, it is linked somehow to slavery or the anti-Black racism that developed around it. And I really wanted to show, how could you understand America if you don't understand slavery? You can't. That moment in 1619 would affect our cultural, political, social, and economic development in ways that almost no other institution in this country has. And it was time to tell the truth about that in a place like the New York Times. But what was just as important was who was going to tell that truth, and that it was necessary that those who were telling that story, that almost all of them were those who had descended from that very system. And so the writers were very carefully selected, that most of the writers of the essays were Black. All of the poets and creative writers were Black. All of the artists were Black. All of the photographers were Black. That it would be, the issue in and of itself would be a testimony to the descendants, because we have gotten to the position where we can produce this work in the New York Times, and that we could tell our own stories. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Also, I noticed that there's a lot of attention, especially in the first essay, to the issue of democracy.
Absolutely.
The myth of democracy and the founding of this nation. Do you find, and you even state, no one cherishes freedom more than those who have not had it.
Yes.
And to this day, Black Americans, more than any other group, embrace the democratic ideals of a common good. Does that, in your mind, tell us more about democracy as a myth, though, right? The necessity of slavery, and therefore Black people, for anyone to have a notion of what freedom could mean or should mean as an ideal that we all strive for, but it's usually the psychic, physical, ethical, and the political always falls on Black people's shoulders. I mean, can you just kind of talk about this complicated relationship or thought process you had about democracy as a myth?
Yeah, so I knew that I was going to open the project by writing this essay that was looking both at our founding hypocrisy and what I consider the unparalleled role that Black Americans have played in actually perfecting this democracy. Because it does two things. One, if you want to understand racial inequality and the development of our country, then you have to understand the 400-year effort to hide the lie of our founding. And of course, this project argues our founding was not 1776, that our true founding was that moment we decided that we were going to engage in the slave trade. And you know, when you compare it to a place like ancient Greece or ancient Rome, the difference is we were a country, so yes, slavery is an ancient practice, but we were a country founded on the idea of the individual rights of men, on universal equality. The words of the Declaration, many Americans can say those opening words without having to read them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed from the Creator with inalienable rights. So to be founded on those ideals and make that public assertion to the world while holding 1/5 of your population in absolute bondage who will enjoy none of those rights corrupts a nation in a way that you're not psychically corrupted if you never pretended to be a country that believed in individual rights. So that founding paradox meant we've had to cover up and justify that lie. And the racial caste system, the debasement of black people, the violence, the sheer type of terroristic violence that black people have faced has all been in trying to prove that we the people was not a hypocrisy, because black people were not people. And if black people are not people, then there is no hypocrisy in our founding documents. And how do you best prove that someone is not human? It is by the constant dehumanizing of those folks. The type of violence that black people experienced became the balm of white supremacy. It became the way that we could justify for every generation why we excluded people and why we were basically founded on a lie. So when I was thinking about the essay, I was thinking about our creation myths. And I'm really interested in the idea of national memory. How do we come to have a collective understanding of who we are? And what are the things we tell ourselves? And what are the things that we left out in order to create that myth and that common understanding? And of course, we tell ourselves about us being an exceptional nation, when in fact, we were very normal for a white colonial nation, because all of them practiced slavery, and so did we. We were actually a slaveocracy and not a democracy. What was important to me, though, was we all kind of have a fundamental, if not complete, understanding that black people's physical labor built this country, right? We understand, we all have grown up saying, our people built this, the wealth of this country was built on our backs, but we're talking about kind of an idea of a brute physical labor, but not an intellectual labor that also built the country. And so even us all being able to say that we physically built the country is in effect still fulfilling the stereotype of what black people were here to do, which was to be a labor force, and that we actually had nothing intellectual to contribute. So I wanted to push back against that narrative and say, yes, we did build the economic wealth, we did build the infrastructure, we did teach the colonists things like irrigation, how to grow rice, we did teach all of those things. But what we did much more importantly was actually, as close of a democracy as we have, we built that too. But we never get the credit for that. So when you think that Thomas Jefferson, I mean, go back to Crispus Attucks, first person to die in the American Revolution, is a fugitive from slavery. He has run away from slavery and died for a country for which his people would not have those rights for another 100 years. If you look at, as Thomas Jefferson is drafting the words of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, he owns 130 people on a forced labor slave camp where black folks, including children, are tortured in order to get them to produce the work that would make his wealth. And as he's writing those words, his own enslaved family member, his brother-in-law, who is the brother of his wife, they shared the same father, but his enslaved property was the child of one of the enslaved people that his wife's father owned. Then we see that the founders actually didn't believe in their ideals that they wrote down. Almost half of the founders practiced slavery. So when they're writing these rights into the Constitution and the Declaration, they don't believe in them. But black folks did. So black people read those words and actually took them literally. And black folks read those words as a sign that they were going to fight for their liberation. And that really has been the role that black people have played prior to 1776, all the way up till now. You can look at the Reconstruction Amendments and see that these are the amendments that actually make the Constitution whole. These are the amendments that end slavery, though slavery never mentions, or excuse me, the Constitution never mentions slavery until the 13th Amendment abolishing it. The 14th Amendment, which gives equal protection before the law, which all Americans, all marginalized Americans, women, gay Americans, immigrant rights groups have all used the 14th Amendment and the struggles of the civil rights movement to gain their own rights. When the gay Americans went before the Supreme Court saying that they have a constitutional right to marry, they used the 14th Amendment, which was pushed by formerly enslaved people to give them citizenship. So when we think about black people have fought in every war, black people have always fought for liberation of people abroad, and then had to come back home and fight for their own liberation against their own countrymen, and have never fought only for their own rights. If you read any of the civil rights laws that get passed, they aren't just giving rights to black people, they're giving rights to all marginalized people. When you look at the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, they bar discrimination based on race, but also on nationality, also on gender. Eventually, they would also bar it based on disability status. But we don't ever get the credit for the role that we've played in the democracy. Because if you give us the credit, then you have to acknowledge that we were not a democracy, that we were not founded as a democratic republic. We were founded as a slaveocracy. We want to somehow pretend that the fact that 10 of our first 12 presidents were enslavers was just incidental, accident of fate. That's ridiculous, right? We know the most powerful men are the men who become president, and in this country, you became amongst the most powerful men because you built your wealth on the backs of human bondage. This is what I hope the essay would do, was really transform the way that our fellow country men and women understand the role of black folks, and that we actually believed in this country in a way that our founders did not. But much more important than that, you know, I opened with the story of my dad flying this damn American flag in the front yard, and how as a child I was deeply embarrassed by his outward display of patriotism. And I didn't understand how a black man who was born on a cotton plantation in Greenwood, Mississippi, because the hospital didn't serve the black residents, who had never known a day of being treated like a first-class citizen, could fly this flag. I didn't feel like we had a claim to it, and black people are born with the feeling that we don't have a claim to our own country. And by the end of the article, I come around to saying, actually, no one has fought harder to make this country a democracy and to make this country live up to its ideals, and how dare anyone rob us of that legacy. So the message to black Americans of this project, and particularly my essay, is that we don't have to feel a sense of shame, and we don't have to feel a sense that we don't have a right to claim our own country, that we literally physically built, and I would also argue spiritually built, that this is our home, and we need to stop being treated as a problem because we've never been a problem. Sorry, it was a really long answer. Sorry, y'all. My essay's really long too, so just get used to it.
No, I mean, for me, that was one of the most moving entries into the piece. Listening to the sounds of the water, thinking about the Middle Passage, and how we have no narrative records or autobiographies about the Middle Passage. It was such a horrific experience. Nobody documented it. And that's why it's interesting to me that you use the word anniversary, because anniversary for 1619 is not just a commemoration, or it's also in a memoriam. Right? It's a funereal occasion as well, a yearly anniversary of a death. And so how did you negotiate the essays that talk about this ongoing, the history, the nadir, post-Reconstruction, the violence of Jim Crow, the mortgage crisis, the slave body literally being the currency that allowed for mortgage lending to begin with at the founding of this nation. how do you negotiate between these two, this idea of rupture and collective memory that needs to be recaptured? Right? Knowing that there's no way that we could actually get the dates for those who were placed on those ships on the Middle Passage to arrive in 1619. But at the same time, we also live in a nation, and even in this city, that celebrates these memorials with these second lines are funereal occasions. Right? So yeah, that's my question.
I mean, I think that is the definition of the Black American experience, is we are a people born of that rupture. I say in my piece that it was the teal eternity of the Atlantic Ocean, that unlike every other group in this country who either chose to come here or indigenous people who were in the land of their culture, we had a severance that no other people has experienced. And because of that, we literally did have to create ourselves here. And we have long been taught, I think, to be ashamed of that, right? Like we're taught, you don't have your own language, you have the names of the white people who owned you, that we have to look to the continent of Africa, and you have to say the continent because clearly we don't know where. We know probably West Africa or Central Africa, but we don't know exactly where we even came from. That we had to look somewhere else to get a sense of pride because we are a damaged people, a people who are severed from our roots, but that's not true. And I think what was important is to show that we created really an amazing new people on these lands, that everything that was done to us, our resistance to that and our determination to be fully human meant that we actually ended up being the most American of all. That's the thing that really got the folks who didn't like my project. That those who were considered the least, so the least that you weren't considered a human, that you were considered to never be able to be a citizen in your own country. When the Supreme Court rules in Dred Scott that Black people are not citizens of the only country that they and their family members had ever known for generations, it says that Black people are a slave race. So whether you are free or enslaved, you are part of a slave race and therefore can never have citizenship. And so for us to say, actually, this slave race you think you created is actually the American race, that we are people who are wholly created here, that all original American culture, and by American I don't mean on the land of America, I'm not negating Native American culture, I'm saying America is in the country of America, that when you hear the American music, it's our voice, it's our percussion, it's our horn that they hear. When you see a style of dress and a certain aesthetic that is Black American, it's really this kind of amazing thing to realize that when they thought they were destroying us, they were actually helping us to create a new people here who have the most claims on our country. Imagine if our children can grow up with that understanding instead of the understanding that so many of us had to grow up under, and how powerful that would be. I really don't think I'm answering your questions. I think you're asking me questions and I just talk about what I want to say, but
Perfect.
This is why it's hard to interview a journalist, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try harder.
No, I mean, I want to pick up on what you're talking about in terms of violence. It takes an extremity of violence in order to subjugate people to this extent. And
yes.
A lot of the essays that we're talking about capitalism talked about how rationalistic capitalism was at the beginning of the slaveocracy. But post-Reconstruction, that violence is no longer rationalistic but gratuitous. Because once Black people were no longer property, they could no longer be, you can't collect insurance on damaged property. What do you think the 1619 Project teaches us about violence right now as a legacy of enslavement? How violence isn't necessarily rationalistic anymore.
So I'm going to come back to that part. I don't actually agree that it's not. I think the violence after Reconstruction was also rational, but for different reasons. So when you think about again, think about how you're taught about slavery. And think about how we're taught about that period, if you're taught at all about the period after slavery. Because usually in your history books, you go from slavery just so you can talk about the Civil War, and then Martin Luther King giving the I Have a Dream speech, as if there's nothing that happened in between, as if there was not a sustained 100-year period of racial terrorism all over this country. And so when you think about how we're taught certain things, how you're not taught about the, as you said, very rational violence of the plantation, it is a way to, one, give clean hands to say, yes, we practiced slavery, but it wasn't that bad. But also, it is a way to further dehumanize us as if we just willingly submitted to our bondage. The only way, I mean, you know, they're doing a reenactment of the largest rebellion of enslaved people in America. Of course, it's going to be coming through New Orleans tomorrow. The only way you control, nobody willingly submits to slavery. Nobody. Nobody. The only way you can control a population, and especially in the places like New Orleans, parts of, you know, Louisiana, South Carolina, Mississippi, where black people often outnumbered white people, is through intense violence and the threat of violence. And we had a lot of discussions about this in the project because I thought it was very necessary to talk about that violence in every single essay. But it's finding the appropriate balance of how we need to tell the truth. We need to be confronted with the type of violence that it takes to enslave 4 million people, but not further dehumanize those people in how you're talking about the violence. So the violence, you know, when you think about when an enslaved person did something that enslavers felt disrupted the plantation or could lead to resistance, the punishment was always public. And the punishment was always severe. It had to be severe enough to scare people into never doing this. So it wasn't just, I'll beat you behind the shed. It is, I'm going to beat you until you pass out, and then I'm going to hang you from a pole in the square, and I'm going to call all the enslaved workers in to watch this and be a witness to what's going to happen. Or I'm going to bury you into the ground and leave your head above so the animals and the insects can get into your eyes and get into your mouth, and everyone else is going to watch the suffering. Because by doing that, it sends the message that you may outnumber us, but if you step over that line, not only will you be hurt or maybe killed, but you will suffer first. That same rational type of violence follows Reconstruction. It's the same thing. It is still using violence as social control. It is using violence to maintain the caste system, and it is a public display, right? So they're advertising lynchings. They are saying, we are going to lynch this man on this day. Come out and watch the lynching. And then the level of brutality. So it's not, again, just shooting someone and killing them. It's, we're going to castrate you first. We're going to drag you through town. We're going to string you up. We're going to burn you alive. Then we're going to dismember you and pass your body parts out. Or as they did in Atlanta, they displayed Sam Hose's knuckles in the storefront window. Or as they did in Maryland, they cut off this man's body parts, drove into the black part of town, and threw the body parts on the lawns of black folks to tell them, this is what will happen to you if you step out of line. And that violence is necessary because black people, the only reason we exist in America was to be exploited labor, period. We were never supposed to be citizens. We were never supposed to be part of the body politic. We were here to labor. Once we are no longer allowed to be enslaved by law, either we need to be shipped somewhere else, we need to die out, or we need to be forced back into an exploited force of labor. And that is, of course, what happened. That's why this generation of black folks who, 100 years after slavery, were still working on the same plantations. How do you force people to do that? Is through the constant threat of violence. And we like to think of the lynch mob as a bunch of rowdy, poor white folks just wantonly stringing people up. It wasn't the case. This was, everyone in town knew what was happening. It was sanctioned. Lynchings didn't typically happen unless they were sanctioned by the powerful white people in the town, and they were designed to also have that sense of fear. And it's this wave of violence that starts leading to the Great Migration. And black people are having to sneak out of town. We can't just get on the train. We have to hide and get out of town because we are the labor force. So the violence provided social control, but I also argue that the violence became the psychological balm of white supremacy, right? If you treat people the way that you wouldn't treat an animal, then they're an animal. And then you can justify all of our founding lies, all of our founding hypocrisies, because these people didn't really deserve those rights because they're not fully human. And every generation has to re-up on that violence. Because the interesting thing about the Dred Scott case, when the court, when the highest justice says black people are a slave race, not that slavery is a condition, but a slave race. You have to say that because if you say that you justify slavery because black people are not human like we are, they are less than we are. They are so less than we are that they don't have, you can't legally rape a black person, you can't legally murder a black person, they don't have the rights to their own children, they can't make a will, they can't own property. Then in the moment of freedom, you can't say, oh, actually now you're equal like everyone else, because then that gives lie to the whole justification. So instead, at the moment of freedom, you say, actually, your race is a slave race. Your people, it wasn't the condition that was dehumanizing. You are not human. And we justify that by that violence that tells us if you would not treat a normal human being like this, then these people are not actually human. And we can look all the way to how police violence functions now. So the same, you see the same, you know, I will not say same because nothing is like slavery, but you see the systems just adapt, and you see surveillance. You see the use of how many times do you go in a black neighborhood and see black men lined up against the wall, right? These are public displays of the police state, of the ability to control, of the fact that we'll pull a gun on you and we can kill you. That serves as a form of violent social control too, and I think that is also very rational.
Thank you. No, I agree with you in terms of the way that we can't use slavery in terms of saying this is literally slavery, but it's more in different names.
Yes.
And when we're talking about state violence as a mode of social control, but it's also what one of my mentors in graduate school used to call it preserves the psychic health of America. Mm. And we're talking about what preserves the psychic health of whiteness is that whiteness gets to distance itself from any kind of culpability in this violence. In order to maintain whiteness, you have to create an essentialized race of slaves, as like you were talking about with the Dred Scott decision. And what I find really stunning in terms of Dred Scott, the artist reenactment, is that it is allowed to happen in a place like Louisiana, even in a performative way, because any type of black insurgency, because of state control and violence, has been beaten out of us with the rise of mass incarceration, making sure that that 100 years of organizing that black folks did to bring in the civil rights and black power movement would never happen again. But how do you see what you've done in terms of the 1619 Project, laying the history bare, showing how this violence has morphed and technologically advanced into different ways, as perhaps helping form some mode of insurgent will again?
So the analogy I always use is that the 1619 Project is like taking the red pill on the Matrix. So if you don't read the project, you're living in your blue pill world, and you just go through life and pretend all of this was not intentionally created, and you can just be oblivious. And for those who suffer under this system, you accept the explanations we are given, which is our conditions are a personal failing. Our conditions are a matter of us not wanting. You have been free since 1865, and the civil rights movement was in the 1960s. Get over it. Whatever the problems are, they're your fault. But if you read the 1619 Project, and trust me when I say every story was intentionally crafted in a very particular way to make a very particular argument. If you read the project, you can't unsee the architecture because the project lays out the entire architecture. So it says, look at this thing in modern society that you think actually has nothing to do with slavery, and we are going to use rigorous scholarship and draw all the connections for you, all across American life, to show you that this thing that you wanted to pretend was marginal to the American story, because that's what we have to tell ourselves so we can believe the lies of our founding, that was actually central. And even more important is that the harms of this racism, the harms of this caste system, the harms of our history have not been able to be contained to the population for which they were designed. That's right. So we create this system that we think will just oppress and hurt black folks, but our entire country is worse for it. This is why I signed the story on universal health care. We are willing to let millions of poor white people not have insurance as long as we can get more black people without insurance. This is the truth. So we have these systems, you know, you look at America and you compare us to every Western industrial country that we like to compare ourselves to, except you can't compare us to any of them because we have the stingiest social safety net, not just with health care, but with college, with labor union membership. We have the shortest maternity leave, all of these things, and you can trace the history. It comes down to conversations about, are black people going to get something that we don't think they deserve, and we will sacrifice our own. And they used to be very clear about it. Like I would read the language from the 1930s during the New Deal, you know, the 1940s, 50s, and they would literally say, yes, this is going to hurt some white people, but it's going to hurt a lot more black people. Let it be made manifest. So we've thought, you know, we can live under this delusion that our anti-black racism, that the paradox of our founding doesn't hurt those who think they are the most powerful in this country, but it does. And it's little things like when you're sitting in damn traffic in Atlanta and you're like, it doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense under a system of racism. It's logical. So everyone's time is lost. All Americans are suffering, but black people, of course, are suffering much more and it's much more intensely. So that was important to me, is to expose that architecture and to say, now you can't pretend you didn't know. We are not taught this history and we can sit back and say, well, I'm a good person because I just didn't know better. Well, if you read this project, you can't make that argument anymore. So now you are forced, once you are confronted with the facts of it, the intentionality of it, the fact that if you believe the Constitution still matters, then slavery still matters. You can't pick and choose which parts of our past we want to say are important and which parts of our past we think are irrelevant. And then you are forced, to me, once you know, you either have to do something about it or you have to just acknowledge that you're actually a hypocrite too and you really don't care. Which is mostly what people do.
I mean, and I think that's what's interesting, because what you're talking about is very much along the lines of Du Bois's discussion of the psychological wage of whiteness.
Yes.
Right? So you don't mind being impoverished and abject as long as what you've maintained is the psychological wage of whiteness. But what's the psychological wage of black people who choose to take the blue pill and not take the red pill?
Shit is hard. Taking the red pill means you have to drink a lot of bourbon. Probably don't eat right. No, it's hard, right? Like I don't think it's possible for black people to take the blue pill. We might take like a light-skinned blue pill, but I don't think we could take. I don't think, you know, it's been amazing because. I think one of the reasons the response to this project has been what it is because of who's in the White House right now. And it forced all these well-meaning white people to realize the America that we've always had to live in. And now they're like, oh, wait, I didn't know this was our country. And we were like, ask a black person, exactly. We could have told you that.
Exactly.
Right, so now people who have had the luxury of saying, oh, I was a Hillary Clinton supporter, I'm a good person, are having to confront the reality that we have a country built on white supremacy, literally. Like, it's not radical to say that. It's in the documents. They wrote it down, right? Read notes on the state of Virginia. Read anything that most of the white people who we uphold in this country wrote. And so this shock about who's in the White House is not shocking to people who never had the luxury of not seeing. So I think because of that, I can't say that we ever truly take the blue pill, but many of us haven't had the red pill either. And that's intentional. Like most of the things I know, I taught myself. You didn't get it in school. My parents couldn't pass it on to me. I didn't even get it in college. When I studied it in African American studies, I had to obsessively decide I want to understand this system so that I can write about it, because I don't want to be a race reporter who just says, black people suffer from this, black people suffer from that. I want to show how and why and who did it. But most people aren't getting any of that. I think that's the power of the 1619 Project, is the scholarship is not original. There are, as you know, scholars have been writing about these things for 2.5 centuries. But what's new is that the arguments are made in a very particular way for mass consumption. And regular folks can have access to things that you had to, go to college for, read all of these dense, I don't think boring, but a lot of people think boring history books. And that's the powers. We all need to see. Black people need to see it for our own reasons. We do believe that we're a problem a lot. We have bought into the things that this country has told us that we are, and it's because we don't have a better answer. But this project and all of this type of scholarship gives the better answer, so I think we should be able to walk. I mean, I can't tell you how many folks I've heard that are like, I feel like I can claim my country and feel a sense of pride about that for the first time in my life. And it's not because they feel some flag pin wearing patriotic non-critical pride. It's not a pride about the country that we aren't and pretend to be, but a pride about the work that we have put in to make this the country that it is. And I think that is the work that needs to be done. And white folks need to read this and, deconstruct the you built.
Thank you. And I also think it's not ironic that all of this, when I say all of this, the project, Black Lives Matter, and the Trump presidency comes on the heels of an Obama, 2 terms of an Obama administration. And we were having a conversation before this opened about what can we say Obama actually did for black people? I mean, isn't this along the lines of the blue pill? If you want to maintain that having representation without any material benefit, or you have the murder of Michael Brown, the murder of Trayvon Martin, the execution of Troy Davis, all during a black presidency. And I think perhaps it's losing the idea that having a black face as the face of unethical power would be the solution. But in terms of the 1619 Project, I mean, how much do you think, how much of that gave you the freedom to be able to do the types of critiques that you wanted to do?
How much of what?
Having 8 years of Obama and nothing to show for it in terms of black progress.
Damn, okay. I mean, I kind of expected exactly what we got out of an Obama presidency. I think that I would never talk down on or think down on the symbolic power of a black man rising to the presidency in a country founded on slavery. I think there is a power to that, but I think we should have always known that that was going to be the extent of the power. That you don't rise to the presidency of a country like the United States because you are a radical black person with a radical vision, right, for black equality and nationalism in this country and deconstructing, the state. We knew that. That doesn't mean that there were tons of times I still wasn't disappointed, but my expectations were never high. I think I was just mostly excited he was like actually married to a black person because I didn't think that was going to be true. With that said, the symbolism also clearly mattered because of what it did to white Americans to have a black man and a black family in the White House who wasn't there to serve. Those of us who studied history know that the election of someone like Donald Trump after the election of someone like Obama was the most predictable thing in the world. Right. Every time there has been progress, there is an intense white backlash and a retrenchment and a retraction. Right. Every time. Right. You could see, I mean, I did reporting right after Trump was elected. And I went to these mythical white voters who were Obama to Trump that was like dumbfounding all of the white journalists who just said, you know, they couldn't have possibly been racist because they voted for a black man. And I'm like, Jesus, really? This is your understanding of race, is that white people can never align with black people if they think it's in their best interest? Of course they can, right? Obama comes after 8 years of George Bush, record debt, housing is collapsing, our financial system is collapsing, our economy is tanking, worst recession since the Great Depression. It is under these circumstances where literally folks are like, we can't do worse than this, that you get a black man. And then you get the most qualified black man. And then immediately, lots of white Americans who voted for Obama because they felt for those, at that period, their interests were aligned with him. And as soon as their interests were no longer aligned with him, they didn't vote for him anymore, because we often think about, so there are two things. One, they said, we felt if we voted for Obama, racism would be over.
Yeah, that's what they said.
Y'all got your man in the White House, what else can you complain about, right? And then he made that most benign of comments about Trayvon Martin, which literally was to say the most basic thing in the world, which was, he could have been my son. And they were like, oh, he picked a side, and he decided he was going to be the black president and not the president for all Americans. And that turned them off. And then the Black Lives Matter protests. And they're like, you guys are in the White House. They have Ivy League diplomas. I don't have an Ivy League diploma. And black people are still complaining that there's something wrong with this country. So for many people, the vote for Obama was a vote to never have to hear complaints about racism again. And when that didn't happen, they turned. And then they went back to what has always been the interest. You know, there were so many stories about why do white, middle class, and working class vote against their interest. That's based on the presumption that whiteness is not their interest. And that is the most powerful interest that you can have in this country. Even if you're poor. And it's not to say that there are not struggling white people. There are, but they're not struggling because of their race.
Exactly.
Right? And they still have something on all of us. I mean, Chris Rock does that. I don't really mess with Chris after, you know. Y'all know why. But he has that great line where he's talking about there's a one-leg busboy, white busboy in the auditorium, and he don't want to be me because he's white. He'll be like, you know, I'm not going to trade places with you. I think I'll just ride this white thing out for a while and see where it takes me. Right? We know that whiteness is a value. It is the most valuable thing. And in the end, they just went back to what was the most valuable thing. So none of us could expect that Obama was going to be transformative for race in America. He had to walk such a careful line to even get elected. He had to walk an even more careful line, and he was always signaling to people that I'm not really about black folks like that. Let me go to Morehouse and tell you not to be victims, right? That sort of thing. But I'm more disappointed about what has happened after the presidency, when one would think he would be liberated to actually not have to be within the political constraints. I'm more disappointed with that than what happened during the presidency, because I didn't have a lot of expectations.
Okay. Thank you. Where do you see the 1619 project going in the future? And what other projects do you have lined up now?
You sound like an editor. What's next? I nearly died making this one. Could I just take a moment? What are you going to do now? This wasn't enough? So there's a couple of things. The 1619 Project, clearly, it was a magazine, and even though it was double the size of the normal New York Times magazine, there's still a lot of stories and essays that we were not able to put in there. So we want to keep publishing some additional pieces with that same, rigorous framework. Probably the most glaring absence in the project is the question of restitution. That if you read this whole project, and we're saying people are still suffering that legacy, and really it's not even just a legacy of slavery, it's a legacy of the 100 years of racial terror that follows that, that some people in this room were born into, that my father was born into, that there are living victims of that. And it's good to remember, I'm 43 years old, I was born in 1976. I'm in the first generation of Black Americans in the history of the United States who was born with full citizenship rights. 43 years old. 10 years prior to my birth, it was legal to discriminate against Black people in almost every aspect of American life simply because we descended from people who had been enslaved. We're not talking ancient history. And those rights didn't just come because one day white Americans were like, okay, we've done enough shit, let's just get it together. It was after a sustained and bloody and violent revolution that Black people fought almost entirely on their own, where people were being assassinated on their lawns, strung up, tossed into rivers, children blown up in churches. This is what led us to even get full citizenship rights 350 years after we first landed on these shores. So when we think about it in those terms, we know that you cannot read the 1619 Project and not come away understanding that a debt is owed. And we need to talk about that debt. And we need to talk about why that is a big part of why we won't confront the legacy of slavery, because we know if we do, you gotta write that check. And what is the opposition to that? Because this is the other thing, when we think, we know that Black people have been deprived of the ability to accumulate wealth. We have had wealth extracted both from us physically in our bodies, but also from our communities. We have had our educational opportunities stolen. We have had, my husband. We have had all of these areas where if you look at why we're disproportionately poor, why we have such a wealth gap, it is all because of the racism that we have experienced. That's not good for America, right? When you think about all of this population that isn't able to compete and isn't able to purchase into certain neighborhoods, doesn't have the buying power, doesn't have the wealth to pass down, isn't able to send their children to college, like this is actually bad for all of us. And if we really believed in our country, we would want to pay that debt. We would want to say it's time to make that right so that we can actually get the best and the most out of all of our citizens and stop depriving that same 13% that we always have. So I think that's definitely, I'm working on an essay on that now, so there would definitely be an essay looking at what is owed, and hopefully other creative pieces and other work like that. And one other thing that we're working on, if you looked at the very last page of the magazine, there's a site of a slave auction site. And I had this idea, we just ran out of space and time, that I wanted to do a photo essay showing all of these places all across this country where human beings were bought and sold. And to show what they look like now, because most of them are not marked. There might be a CVS there might not be anything there, and it's just like so analogous to how we have just allowed this history. It lives with us, it's there, and we just ignore it and pretend that it's not. So we're working on a project now to mark those sites and to document those sites where people were bought and sold, and hopefully force communities to confront what happened there.
Thank you. I think we can open it up for questions now.
I have a question, and it's the dichotomy that you're employing when you're talking about the matrix with the red and the blue pill. But a very quick observation. One of President Obama's strongest strengths was his mother-in-law, Miss Robinson. And
Was what?
His mother-in-law,
Oh,
Miss Robinson. And the 14th Amendment that you had talked about it also was the legal basis for the Affordable Care Act being done because it dealt with commerce. There were 2 presidents among the 7 who did not have slaves, and that was John Adams and his son. So that's another observation. And I'm going to get to my question. Right here in front of me is a gentleman who wrote a book, really great book of photography. It's called Freedom Dance, and it's about New Orleans. And in the beginning of the 1619 Project, you start with Clint Smith, and you end with Clint Smith. His mom and daddy sitting right out there. They love maize, too. Wave your hand like joy and pain. And directly across from them is James Borders, who wrote a book called Marking Time, The Chronology of Blacks in Louisiana. So it's very good to be here on this very cold night. But, and you made something about second line. See, in second lines, we put the fun in funerals. Believe me, anybody who's ever been to a second line, you know, you go to a second line for one thing, and that's to feel joyful. And that's what we do. We put the fun in funerals. Now, and this is an out-of-the-box question because you brought it up with the red and the blue dichotomy.
You're making me scared now.
No.
Okay.
And this is just a little bit of levity. All right? Don't get it twisted. Would you consider going out and trying to get some grant money to make it possible that if you write an essay on the 1619 Project, you can go get a Popeye's fried chicken sandwich?
Ms. Jones, can you?
I'm gonna get right on that.
Hi, Ms. Jones. I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 20 years. And I have been trying to get the 1619 Project for a very long time because I'm going to be teaching The Hate U Give, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Frederick Douglass next semester to my 9th graders. And I was wondering, I can give you my name and I can give you my school. And I was wondering if I could get copies because I've been waiting for copies since it first came out.
Ooh, black people know how to put somebody on the spot.
Yes.
This is what how many kids are there?
I have 87 freshmen.
Okay, have you tried the Pulitzer Center?
Yes,
have you reached out to them?
Yes, I have.
And they said what?
Well, everything's online there.
No, they're the ones who are shipping copies to educators.
Oh, they are?
So have you, not just gone to the website, but have you actually contacted them, requested copies?
No, I just gone to the website, so I can go to where can I go?
Oh, you're gonna give it an 80-some copies?
Oh, thank you so
bam.
much. Thank you.
Good evening.
That was easy.
My name is Amber Brown. I just want to say thank you. I was really inspired by this project, so much so that one of my colleagues, I shared it with her, and we're actually here together tonight because similar to what was said previously, really using this as an opportunity to educate others. My question to you is really one that's more so on an individual level, but also something that I think we can all glean from once you answer it. I understand how this project could be very healing. There's a lot of information that could come from it, but at the same time, it is kind of traumatic for us who have not been able to have this knowledge passed down to us. We're reading this for the first time. So my question to you really is, how, really for yourself and also for everyone who worked on this project with you, how did you all take care of yourselves after this? How did you heal from that? And what do you have, what advice or what recommendations would you have for others to really make sure that as you're going through this, taking the time to heal along the process? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. My answer is not going to be good, and I'm not going to recommend it for anybody else. I have not, honestly. I don't actually know how to kind of deal with it. We were talking about this backstage. I mean, my answer is I drink a lot of bourbon, but that's probably not a good mode of self-care. Yeah, no, it's hard because, you know, when I was talking to the professor, I was saying other journalists, when they're writing about other things, they it might be hard, but they leave it at work and then they go home and forget about it. But the work I do in general, and then particularly this project, there was no leaving it at home. It was with me all the time. And to sit for 8 months straight, reading and thinking and processing the worst thing that has ever happened to your people, but also that it happened for 350 years nonstop and is still happening now. And you have to go back home and think about your family members who have been murdered and your family members who have been incarcerated and the people who live in your communities. And you know, my uncle dying at the age of 50 and my father dying before he could get Social Security, and thinking about all of that and how I'm both telling our story but representing our story in my own family. There's been no break. There's been no healing. I cried more working on this than anything I've ever worked on in my life, and I don't know a black person on the project who didn't cry at some point. And I think what I realize, and I say this at the, if you guys listen to the podcast, the very last episode of the podcast, is that I just realized how raw this all still is. Like, we could never heal from something that's never been acknowledged. You can't move on when you're still living the daily pain of that legacy, and there's never been any effort to actually make amends. So what I would recommend for other people, go to counseling, which I don't do, go to church, which I don't do, go to the spa, which I do sometimes when I can. I do think self-care is important because we want to be around here long enough to tell these stories and to do the work that we need to do, and also to be a testament to all of our ancestors. But it's been hard for me to figure out how to heal. Like, the wounds are all still open, and that's why our own family members don't pass this history down to us. I remember trying to get my grandmother and my great aunts, and now there's only one left, to talk about what it was like to grow up in Greenwood, Mississippi. Mississippi lynched more black people than any state, and Greenwood lynched more black people, it was LaFleur County, than any county. And they wouldn't tell me, because who wants to relive the most degrading and horrifying experience of their lives? And so we just push it down, but it's still there. So this is partially why our funerals are joyful, right? Is we were hoping to get that relief when we died, and that person who was dead is not suffering what we're having to suffer here anymore. So I don't really know the answer. I can give advice, I just probably won't take it myself. Thank you for your question.
Hey, thanks for being here. My name is Sean Barney. I'm a business person in town. Plenty of bourbon in New Orleans, by the way, so
Oh, I know.
drink up.
Got a whole street named after it.
Exactly. My question is about just the technical process of getting the project done. I think what is inspiring is when folks have a platform and they decide to use it. Mm-hmm. And so we're getting more platforms, right? And whether it's in entertainment like Black Panther or projects like this, I think you have to take your shot when you get it. So can you talk a little bit about the technical nuts and bolts of pitching, selling the project, and how did you get that done?
Thank you. So I would say that, okay, freedom is being able to do whatever you want, wherever you are. But as a black person, if I'm not in the space to tell black stories, then I don't feel like, what is the purpose of me being there? You shouldn't have to tell black stories, but it's the only reason I ever wanted to be a journalist. And I worked really hard. I had some good luck and some good mentors to get me in a position where I could be at a place like the New York Times and pitch something that's black, and they actually let me do it. Because the most common question I have gotten every single time I give a talk is, what pushback did you get and what obstacles did you have to overcome? Because of course the assumption is you could never do something like this in a place like the New York Times without having to fight to get it done. And for most of my career, I had to fight to tell these stories, but on this project, absolutely none. I pitched it, they immediately said, let's do it, and then it just started getting bigger and bigger. The Times put a rather unprecedented amount of resources into this. We doubled the size of the magazine, even though we didn't double the size of the ads. We went across platforms, an entire special section of the newspaper, the podcast, live events. We just did an all-day symposium at the National Museum of African American History and Culture last week. And I think it was, I had to build up a reputation in the newsroom of being someone who you will find it very difficult to say no to, but also who could produce the work. Because the thing is, every black person in this room knows you don't get a second chance. If you ask to do something like this, it damn sure better be done right. It better be above reproach. It better be the most excellent, sorry, are there kids in here? I cuss a lot. It's gotta be excellent, right? So I was conscious every second of all that weighed upon this and all the pressure of not only to do right by our ancestors, but also not to mess it up for the next person who wants to come after me and pitch something like this. So I worked full time on it, and it was, if you don't work in this industry, it's probably hard to tell how impossible it is to actually pull off a project like this in 8 months. But I contacted 15 of the scholars who I value the most, and I read their scholarship, and I called them in, and we had a massive brainstorming session. It was important for me to get buy-in from scholars in this area, and also not to presume that I know everything and everything that should be told. We had scholars who fact-checked every single story. If you're going to argue that the real founding is 1619 and not 1776, and that black people are the true founding fathers of this country, and that those who are considered the least are the most American, you damn sure better get your facts right. So we had multiple meetings about everything, literally, what language would we use? I created a style book. We weren't gonna call human beings slaves. Slavery was a condition, it wasn't who you are. We weren't gonna call them plantations where we could. These were slave labor camps, and we were gonna call it what it was. And I wanted that style to be uniform across the magazine. There were questions we printed out the entire magazine and laid everything out. And in my story, there was a big photo of a lynching. And you could see the faces of the people who had been lynched. And I was very adamant that we not hide from the violence, and we needed to show the violence, because while we know this, many white Americans have been allowed to pretend it wasn't like that. But at the same time, I'm conscious of, do our people need to open the page and feel further dehumanized by these images? So 2 days before the magazine was supposed to close, I'm like, we got to take that image out and replace it with something else, and that's what we did. So we were thinking about every single thing in there, the balance of male writers and women writers, right? I knew that the New York Times is a paper of record. It is the institution that when people want to understand their times, they go through the archives of the New York Times and see, how did the New York Times cover this? And so to do a project on the 400th anniversary, it needed to be something that when people came back through time, they could look at it and be like, that was a powerful piece of beautiful journalism. And all of us were very conscious of the weight of what we were doing. And to finally try to do right by a people who our entire experience has usually been that the media has done us wrong.
Isn't it safe to say that Dean Baquet, who's your executive editor and the first black executive editor at the New York Times and the New Orleans, had put his career on the line as well to support this project, to have it done on his watch?
I love Dean Baquet, and Dean Baquet hired me, and he's the one who gave me, the ability to be able to do this project. I don't think any of our careers were on the line over this project, but certainly, I think that had we not accomplished what we were supposed to accomplish, it would have been harmful to other black journalists who wanted to do similar big work. I think what we have shown is it hopefully makes it a little more difficult to turn down the next black or brown journalist who has a big radical idea and say, you can't do it, and here's why. And the biggest thing about that is the fact that we can't even fill the orders for copies of the project. Not only did we create something that was powerful, but in an age where people say print is dead, people are writing me at my house cussing me out because they can't get a copy of the project. right? That type of success, which shows you only have that type of success, one, if you empower journalists of color to tell the stories only we can tell, and you give them actual resources, not a shoestring budget, and you allow us to do that work. And what this project shows is if you allow us to do that, we can produce some of the most excellent journalism in this country. So yes, it was a risk for the institution to put out something like that, but I think the bigger risk was, had we failed, what that would have meant for other journalists who are trying to do similar work. Okay, well good, I'm glad I got it. You said it much more succinctly than me.
Hi, thanks again for coming out and talking today and sharing about the project. So I know, like, in this current moment in time, even though we're living in this like outwardly fascist kind of state, it seems like there's all these like moments for things like the 1619 project to be funded and to happen. And I know you all mentioned the Slave Rebellion project earlier, but as a Southern-based like artist and person who's lived in the Gulf South their entire life, there has been a lot of like folks who are descendants of people from the Great Migration coming back, trying to reclaim their history, but often not involving people who live in those regions who've been doing that work because it doesn't have the same amount of funding behind it as it does in like the Northeast or the West Coast, or because they just like don't have the name behind it. So I'm wondering, with the 1619 project, you mentioned hiring mostly Black artists and trying to balance out gender. How did you go about making sure that representation was there? And then when you're doing the plaque project that you mentioned earlier, how do you intend to, as you go to these places, kind of bring in the people who live in these places who may have been tapping into that work some way already, especially like in the South, where often voices are overlooked? Okay.
I think we tried to be very conscious about regional diversity for sure. I mean, Kiese Lehman wrote for it, Jesmyn Ward, both Mississippians who still live in Mississippi. I won't lie, it was definitely skewed towards East Coast writers because I'm part of the liberal New York media and that's what we do. Just playing, kind of. But it is something more to think about, and as we're expanding, we're also thinking about less established writers and artists. Like, how can we, now that we've put this out into the world, how can we use it as an opportunity to showcase a broader range of talent of people who haven't gotten that big shot yet or haven't put out that piece that has made them a household name. So we're definitely thinking about all of those things. I mean, the truth is, again, we had limited space, we had limited time. We were trying, in a way, create a time capsule, and we wanted our most known voices in there. But it's also really important, as someone myself who struggled to get to a big platform and to get to a place where my work could be known more widely, to also help other, and not just with artistic pieces, but other writers who aren't as established to be able to have the opportunity. So I hear that. On your second question, I wasn't sure about the beginning part of it.
I guess it was about the plaque. You mentioned doing a plaque project about places that were slave ports or where people were like enslaved people were brought.
Yes.
And I was wondering with that, because I know Charleston's a place, there's a place here actually in New Orleans, like how you would go about maybe bringing in some of that Southern, like those Southern folks to help with that who have been doing like the work, because that was kind of one of the critiques that happened with the Slave Rebellion project, is often Dred is from New York or Chicago and based in New York and doing work down here. Just how to bring in the legacies and the work of the people in these regions.
So yeah, let me, just to be clear, it's not our intention as the New York Times to go into communities and place plaques. What we're hoping is, by marking these spaces, we can start much the way that Brian Stevenson has done with the lynching monument and the soil collections, where he asks people to go into their own communities and collect the soil from the places where people have been lynched. We're hoping to provide the information and kind of the impetus to get communities to mark these spaces themselves. And that absolutely, it doesn't need to be, Nikole Hannah-Jones flying in from New York to place a plaque. It needs to be the people who have lived in those communities where these things have happened, determining how to memorialize them. But what we hope is that we can move to a point to get communities to memorialize them. So absolutely, your instincts on that are 100% correct.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
We have time for just 2 quick questions. So.
Hi, my name's Bruce Hines. I'm a physician. I went to Xavier University Medical School here. Thank you. Your project is stimulated a lot of questions and points of thought here. But I have a question for you, which may not be, it may be above your pay grade, it may be a question for all of us. And that is, how do we claim ours? What must we be willing to do? Restitution, does it ask them for our solution? Awareness, a good first step. Are we able to guilt them into our solution? What does it actually accomplish? Is voting the solution for slavery, the unpaid internship, or whatever they call it? What's the answer? How do we claim it?
Okay. Well, let me just start by saying, personally, I love making people feel guilty, so I don't have no problem with that. But it's not a guilt. This is the thing, like, this project is not about making white people feel guilty for something that they did not do. What it is saying is, this is our inheritance, and whether you want it or not, you have benefited from that system, and you have to take the steps to dismantle the current system right now that you are participating in. I'm not asking a single white person to apologize to me for slavery. I wasn't enslaved, you didn't enslave me. But the conditions that came out of that are existing right now, and folks need to know that they're making a choice to either uphold them or destruct them. In terms of restitution, you know, no, restitution will never make everything right. It's not like if a reparation bill gets passed, we will be equal, all discrimination will have disappeared, and we will have reached the promised land. Restitution in and of itself is just restitution. It is saying a debt is owed, a wrong has occurred, and you need to pay. It's you know, we know this all over American law. If your loved one goes to the hospital and doesn't come out alive because of something that doctor did that that doctor shouldn't have done, the way in our law that we acknowledge that harm is to say you are owed restitution for this wrong that was done. It doesn't bring your loved one back. It doesn't make your life whole, but it says that you can't commit a crime or atrocity and not have to pay for that. That's all that reparations is. Reparations is saying a harm was done and you need to pay for that. And since the primary vehicle of that harm in this country was the extraction of wealth, then that needs to be part of the payment. I don't think reparations is just a payment, but I think it certainly has to be part of the solution. So I don't think that we should think about it in those terms. They're really two distinct. Restitution needs to be paid, and this country needs to keep working to actually make black people full citizens. And there's no guilt to be found unless you're doing something that you need to be guilty of. And that's for everybody to assess on their own.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Jewel. Thank you so much for coming.
You follow me on Twitter?
Maybe.
Oh, because your face looks familiar, sorry.
Thanks. I started thinking a lot when you were discussing the reaction that you got from this project from other black people on how proud they were to be seen as to understand some form of patriotism or just pride in being an American. And for me personally, the first thing that came into my head is I don't know, in my household, that was not something that, and you talked about that, how we were not raised to think that way. So these are just some notes, and then it goes into the question that I want to share with you. So we were chatteled to create a material capitalist system that therein harms ourselves. We did not create this on our own volition, but it is what we have to subject ourselves to because it is what our material conditions are. This is where we live. We created it, but now we also hurt ourselves in this creation. But we weren't actors in this. We were forced to do so I understand that. But in the definition of democracy, for black people, I just don't see it necessarily as for Americans within that umbrella term of whatever that means. Democracy is not really fighting for your freedom. I feel like democracy is abdicating power to the state in excessive amounts of your freedoms in exchange to live in this police state. So the representations of collectivism, self-organization, and so-called nationhood that would actually protect and uphold blackness looks nothing like what this state projects onto us as democracy. Can we say the revolts in which we have tried to fight for our freedoms truly are done in the name of democracy, or were we fighting for the false promises of democracy, for what democracy is, but not something more for liberation and retrieval of the sense of self outside of the black-white binary that has been raised upon us by our oppressors? Were we fighting to survive? Is that the legacy? Can we now focus on the right to thrive? Is like promoting the idea that of like democracy as in what we need to uphold actually what we should be focusing on is I think what I'm trying to get to. I know those were a lot of words. But
Those were every word you learned in college.
For sure.
Break the question down to me in a layperson's term. Because
Okay. So I honestly feel like democracy is, you said that, democracy is a lie. What we understand democracy to be is not what it actually is practiced as. And I just am trying to grapple with how we are having like patriotism or pride over being American when the legacy that we had to fight for is a legacy of only being able to survive. Like you said that you were like the first generation to be able to actually have, like, be able to live in America with like full rights as Americans, but like even as in now, like we do not truly have those rights. So like how can we truly be proud of like what democracy is and like of this country if still we are still continuing to like fight for survival? Like, is that what we need to be talking about?
So you haven't read my essay, right?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
I just got here.
My essay is not arguing that we should be proud of our country and our democracy. My essay is saying that we should be proud of our efforts to make the country what it can be, not of the country that it is.
But is it worth, I'm sorry.
You want me to answer?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay. So when you think about my argument, she's okay. Yeah, she's okay.
Thank you.
I appreciate the challenge. So I'm not speaking of deifying our history or our past or our country or our founders. I don't even know if democracy is the best form of governance. This is what we've been taught. Though I will say, I would like to have a vote and I would like to have a say in how my country is run. What I'm arguing for is saying that we have been a people who have no other land but this one, who have told that we don't have a right to claim it. That we don't have a right to claim our history here, our contributions here, and that is the patriotism that I'm talking about. I think I said this earlier. I'm not talking about the flag pin type that says this is the greatest country that ever existed. Clearly, it is not. Our very existence here is what gives lie to that narrative. But what I am saying is that those ideals, right, that all people are equal, that we all have certain rights that are undeniable, those are the right ideals. And black people, more than any other group, have believed in them because we are the group who is most deprived of them. And that is a beautiful thing and something that we should feel very prideful of. When you look at the way I close my essay out, and when I say, if maybe in this 400th year, can we finally stop seeing black people as a problem but as a solution? And that's because of all groups, we fight the most for the common good. We support programs for the common good at the highest rate of all people. We believe in an America that says we take care of each other. We believe in an America that says, even if I don't agree with you or your lifestyle, or I don't agree with your religion, if I don't believe that where you came from is not where I come from, that every person before the law should be treated the same. And I don't know how that is anything other than what we should feel pride in, that is the America that we can be. But it's not about the America that you learn in a history book, and it's not about saying, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson created this exceptional nation. It is not. But we are an exceptional people, and we are pushing this to be an exceptional nation, and that we should feel a great deal of pride about.
Thank you. The last thing, I know I have to leave.
You're okay.
The last thing that, what I understood from what you just said, which I completely resonated with, is that is black, and that is like what we do as a community, and like how we take care of each other outside of America.
But how do you separate us from America? I don't know how far back you can trace your folks, but
Yeah.
I don't know where in Africa we came from, but I know 5 to 6 generations of my family are Americans.
Yeah.
So how can you separate? This is probably the core thesis of the project, which is this is not a story of Black American history. This is a story of American history. And to separate our communities out from the larger American project is to actually say that we are not fully American. We're central. That's the whole point of this project, is we are central to the American story, and you cannot separate those two, because as much freedom as we have, as much liberation as we have, as much democracy as we have, is because Black people fought both abroad and at home to bring that here. And that is a beautiful thing, and we should not try to segregate that legacy.
Okay.
Right? And if you even look at, they just had this polling out about, so Black people have, double unemployment rate of white people, no matter what the economy looks like. Lowest wealth rates, the most economic instability, most likely for our families, if we get into the middle class, for our children to fall back down into poverty of all racial groups. And yet we are the most giving. So they just had a study that, a poll about groups wanting to allow refugees into this country. And of all groups, Black people had the highest rate of saying, yes, if people are suffering someone else, let them in. We have the most to lose, but we still want people to come in, right? We have the highest rates of belief in universal health care of all groups, highest support for a livable wage, highest support for public schools and the common good. This is the America that we're claiming, not that other America, and we don't allow anyone to take that from us, and I think that's really the thesis of my argument. Thank you.
Please give both of our speakers a wonderful round of applause for this evening.
Thank you, guys.